Why should you go to church? That's a question worth considering. My previous video was a response to Dr. Jordan Peterson's message to the Christian church. It has done quite well in comparison to my other videos on YouTube, and as a result of some feedback and correspondence that I've had in the wake of its release, I have some reason to believe that Dr. Peterson has received and potentially been among those that have watched it. The forms of new media that we have access to are astounding. That I can turn on some lights and a camera in my home office and then record and publish a video that has the potential to reach millions, including a high-profile individual with whom I have little hope of an audience, is nearly incredible to me. But I digress. 5 days after the release of my video, in which I submitted a challenge to Dr. Peterson asking him, when will you darken the doors of the church? His team released a video on YouTube entitled, Why Should You Go to Church? It might be presumptuous of me to think that the release of his video had something to do with my post, but I'd like to wishfully think that it did. Be that as it may, or may not be. His answer to that question was cut from a longer conversation between he and an Orthodox icon carver named Jonathan Peugeot. The original conversation took place in Montreal at the end of May and appeared on Dr. Peterson's YouTube channel on June 16th. In the final minutes of their conversation, Peugeot threw out the question, why do people go to church? To which Jordan interjected, why should people go to church? And that is an important question. An ethical question, the question of should, what ought you to do? And it is a question that I have thought about for years. I am a Protestant Christian pastor. I have been engaged in vocational ministry, as we Protestants would call it, for 23 years. Nearly 15 of those years, again, using terms which we Protestants are familiar with, as a senior pastor leading a local congregation. Within that context, Protestant Christians who believe that they have a divine mandate, a Christological commission to evangelistically preach the gospel. In that context, in the church, I have endeavored to see that more people would come to church. Therefore, I have thought long and hard about the question, why should people go to church? What is it that we Christians and churches are doing? What is our purpose? Why do we exist? And why should anybody show up? Why should you go to church? Like many of Dr. Peterson's answers to difficult questions, his answer to this question was meandering and verbose. And I don't say that as a criticism. That's one of the things that many of us who like Jordan Peterson like about Jordan Peterson. His meandering and verbose answers suggest that he has thought long and hard about difficult questions, which is what one must do with difficult questions. Difficult questions are difficult by dint of the fact that they do not have easy or simplistic answers. If they did, they would not be difficult questions. And along those lines, I think that this is one of the reasons that Dr. Peterson has seen large audiences of young seekers, many of whom are young men, where many churches have not had those young seekers show up. Christians, and especially Christian leaders, are woefully guilty of offering glib and pat answers to difficult questions. Answers which fail to even begin to recognize the heart of the question and belittle the intelligence of sincere seekers. Therefore, sincere seekers set out to find answers elsewhere. For many years, we have been told that the best answers will be found in or from science, as if the scientific method were some clairvoyant oracle that would solve all of our deepest and most complex issues. It has not, and it will not. There is a growing recognition that that's true, and an increasing dissatisfaction with the priestly experts of our academic temples of science. Thus, the sincere seekers, like sojourners wandering haplessly in the desert, have ambled about from one dry well to another, seeking for anything to slake their thirst. And having found little to sufficiently satisfy, they've begun to question the validity of their questions. The quest for answers has become for some a meaningless Sisyphean task. Enter Jordan B. Peterson. And not only Jordan Peterson, but Eric Weinstein and Joe Rogan, maybe Sam Harris and others who in about 2017 began to be known as the intellectual dark web. They didn't necessarily have answers to the difficult questions, but they were willing to wrestle with them publicly. And this is, I think, one of the major things that has set Dr. Peterson and others apart. It is what has in large part attracted the great audiences that pastors like me and churches like the one that I pastor would love to reach. Sincere young seekers. And as time has gone by, Dr. Peterson has not only publicly wrestled with difficult questions, but he has suggested potential answers as well. But those answers, in and of themselves, they still leave something to be desired in the seeker. The answer alone, even if it is a good answer, leaves the seeker seeking for something deeper. And this is actually why many of these individuals are now turning to religion and showing up at church. The thing that post-Reformation Protestant Christianity has failed to recognize, or perhaps has forgotten, is that church does not exist merely to answer the difficult questions. Although I do think that the faith of Christ provides reasonable and well-reasoned answers to the most important, difficult questions of existence and meaning in life. But again, the church does not exist to answer questions only. The church exists to make genuine and meaningful connection with God and one another possible. That's what the church that I pastor is focused on, life in connection with God, one another, and the world through Jesus. Why should you go to church? To connect with God and one another in a meaningful way. Now, I'm not foolish enough to say that we at Cross Connection Church, the church that I pastor, have that perfectly figured out, but that's what we aim at, to connect with God and one another. And to connect with God and one another within the context of the local church, it requires sacrifice and commitment. It requires a commitment of energy, assets, and time. It doesn't happen in one visit. It doesn't happen overnight. Church is not a place that you go to occasionally to have an unbelievably soothing experience. It isn't about developing an appreciation for the ritualistic practices of the institution. Church is the gathering of a people connected to God and one another through Christ. And as you engage with a local church, you will probably have to learn to tolerate the perceived or real inadequacies of the institution, the leaders, and the people that make up the congregation. You'll have to learn to tolerate those perceived or real inadequacies because the congregation, its leaders, its organization, it is made up of people like you, imperfect and sinful people who need forgiveness, redemption, and transformation that is only found in Christ. And as you commit to a local congregation and begin to connect with God and his body, the church, you will find answers to the deepest existential questions and the oneness of communion that the Spirit of God brings. And this is why I would challenge Dr. Peterson to find a church that he can connect with and commit to. You cannot call upon the church to engage young men and challenge young men to engage with the church if you yourself are unwilling to do the same. So maybe among your 24 rules that have been published in your books, or the total of 42 rules, you should add a 43rd. Do not suggest to others what you will not do yourself.